Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Friday, July the 16th, 2021. First up, Biden and Facebook sitting in a tree, KISSING. Let's go to Jim Kunstler's column for today. Enemies of the people. Edging now into high summer, the Joe Biden apparatus swerves toward the totalitarian seizure of all communications. A White House equerry named of Jeff Zients, with the awesome title COVID Response Coordinator, called on Biden allied groups, DNC, NSA, AFT, CCP, to monitor short message services, SMS, i.e. texts, on cell phones in search of, quote, disinformation being spread about vaccinations, unquote. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy called social media to step up to address, quote, false claims feeding vaccine resistance, unquote. And White House Press Secretary Jen, not Jennifer, but Jen Psaki, let slip that, quote, we're flagging problematic posts for Facebook that spread disinformation, unquote. Kunstler comments, America is oh so problematic. You people are working a little too hard to think for yourselves, you basket of deplorable brain-damaged flyover gorks. So pardon us while we remove your impure thoughts from the nation's thought spaces. We will do your thinking for you because, one, we know better, and two, we say so. Can you see now how things are working perfectly toward an autumn explosion of, shall we say, unpleasant disagreeableness? Meanwhile, Joe Biden and Biden allied groups have engineered the U.S. intel and security labels to label anyone and anything that opposes the shutdown of wrongthink as white supremacist domestic terrorism. The FBI officially tweets, family members and peers are often best positioned to witness signs of mobilization to violence, help prevent homegrown violent extremism. Visit go.usa.gov/XSMJF to learn how to spot suspicious behaviors and report them to the FBI. Nice setup. Thus, Nancy Pelosi and Merrick Garland's year-to-date production of the Capitol insurrection pageant and the captivity in solitary confinement for months on end, and in defiance of habeas corpus of January 6th hapless selfie-snapping trespassers, that should prevent any outfit outside BLM and Antifa from mounting mostly peaceful protests, especially against Joe Biden's creeping totalitarianism. Yet the flop sweat is running like a babbling brook from end to end down Pennsylvania Avenue, as in actual fact the Joe Biden show lurches into its final act, which will be the collapse of the Joe Biden show in an odoriferous heap of bad faith and criminality. The specter of election audits is getting to the animatronic teleprompter reader heading the federal regime. His Chamberlains foolishly sent him out to Philadelphia this week to squelch any rising sentiment among PA state legislators to audit alleged ballot irregularities. Joe B's legitimacy is shredding, and he looks more and more like a ghoul in the Oval Office, Jacob Marley in Uncle Sam drag, waiting and whispering of his political sins. In Philly, the poor boob said, for those who challenge the results and question the integrity of the election, no other election has ever been held under such scrutiny and such high standards. Just to be clear, I should point out, as is mandatory, that Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. was indeed the legitimate winner of the presidential election of November of last year. And anyone who holds to the contrary is a conspiracy theorist dissimulating and pushing out disinformation. Biden's mouthful in Philly was followed by an even bigger gap. The big lie is just that, a big lie. Did he know what he said there? Cue Joseph Goebbels spinning in grave with admiration. The utterance was perhaps the perfect companion to his big brag on the campaign trail last October, saying, quote, We have put together, I think, the most extensive and inclusive voter fraud organization in the history of American politics, unquote. And I'm not going to read the rest of this paragraph and move on. See, of course, it's hard to tell now whether the Joe Biden Act will go down in a flaming glob of redacted or just on sheer abysmal performance, trying to put over one great big totalitarian hustle while the real economy craters and institutions auger into bits of corruption, recklessness, and incompetence. For instance, Secretary of State Antony Blinken's astounding move to invite a committee of UN rapporteurs to assess America's standing vis-a-vis human rights and racism. Great idea. Let's get envoys from Liberia, Yemen, Laos, Venezuela, El Salvador, and Chad to hold a critical race theory struggle session with the staff in Foggy Bottom. Or hey, maybe it's time to defund the State Department. When all else fails to control the rest of U.S. population, it's back to good old reliable COVID-19. The Delta variant is upon us, they say. Face masks are back in California in contradiction to the CDC's latest directives. That ought to seal the deal on Governor Gavin Newsom's recall election fate, scheduled now for September 14th. But can anyone rescue the state from sliding completely down the drain? How about another round of lockdowns to ensure that nobody ever tries to start a small business again? Well, you know, small business is racist. Look at how many people of color are prevented by racism from starting small businesses. We demand social justice. Abolish small business there, America. I fixed that for you, Jim Kunstler concludes. From the Daily Mail, Christopher Eberhardt. White House admits it is flagging problematic posts to Facebook they believe spread disinformation about the COVID vaccine, sparking Glenn Greenwald to call the move a hallmark of fascism. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said they're flagging problematic posts. This riled up critics, who, including Glenn Greenwald, who ripped the White House in an 8-tweet thread. He said the president shouldn't be allowed to flag content that he considers problematic. Psaki's comments came the same day U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy said health misinformation is a serious threat to public health. Psaki criticized Facebook for not working fast enough to remove harmful, violative, it's a new word to me, posts and ban the sources of the posts. Psaki's comments during Thursday's press briefing, during which she said that the White House has increased disinformation tracking and is working with Facebook and popular influencers who can get accurate information out to the public. All right, so we have the President of the United States, or at least his administration, actively admitting that they are censoring opinions of which they do not approve. And the reaction from the elite, from the media, from the former members of La Résistance is, yay, Biden, gotta stop that misinformation and disinformation. We cannot have free speech in the United States because it is literally killing people. Golly, if only Donald Trump had thought of that. Or, I don't know, Lyndon B. Johnson or Richard Nixon. How much easier their presidencies would have been if they followed the Biden path. In an 8-tweet thread posted Thursday afternoon, Greenwald said this idea that a president's administration can remove content it deems problematic is dangerous. If you don't find it deeply disturbing that the White House is flagging internet content that they deem problematic to their Facebook allies for removal, then you are definitionally an authoritarian. No other information is needed to know about you to know that, Greenwald tweeted. There are hundreds of reactions to his thread, and opinions have been split. When boiled down to their simplest forms, people arguing for cracking down on medical misinformation says it's important to get correct information to the public to save lives. Others argue that outlets like Facebook shouldn't be an arm of government and have no right to ban or censor dissenting voices. And Facebook continues to insist that it is not a publisher, it is merely a platform. Ha, 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 ha. But you can see what's going on here. I don't know whether an actual overture was made from the Biden admin to Mark Zuckerberg, or merely whether, they both saw what the game was. There have been calls for antitrust action against Facebook. There have been calls for it to actually abide by Section 230. But so long as Zuck plays along with Joe, then Facebook doesn't have to worry about that. There is no circumstance, Greenwald tweeted, none in which it's acceptable for the White House or any other agency of the government to be providing lists to Facebook of problematic content it wants removed. Yet that's exactly what Psaki is doing. The White House is admitting they're compiling lists of people who they claim are posting content they regard as problematic and that constitute misinformation, and are demanding Facebook remove them. This is authoritarianism. As I've documented before, the Supreme Court has ruled that the First Amendment's free speech guarantee is violated when government officials pressure or coerce private actors to censor for them. This is exactly what the Biden White House is doing with Facebook. Has the Biden White House also begun identifying books carried by Amazon that it regards as problematic and instructed Amazon to take them down and stop selling them immediately? What's the difference between that and what it's doing with Facebook? What percentage of liberals would also support that? American liberalism, Greenwald continues, especially after the Trump era when it realigned with the CIA, FBI, and neocons, is an absolutely authoritarian faction. Their brains won't process that because they've spent 5 years telling each other that Trump is the fascist, but their movement is a menace. Wondering if the ACLU, that's the American Civil Liberties Union, plans on weighing in at some point soon about the fact that the Biden White House today boasted it is flagging posts it regards as problematic and telling Facebook to take them down immediately. Seems like a relevant issue for them. Dan Gaynor of Media Research Center also ripped into Psaki in the White House by tweeting, being anti-vaccine is part of free speech. Psaki is against freedom. John Cooper tweeted an emoji of 2 red light sirens and said, Jen Psaki says the Biden administration is actively flagging what they deem disinformation about the pandemic to Facebook for censoring what could go wrong. Many people have pointed out that the Wuhan lab leak was once considered a laughable, loony conspiracy theory until the last couple of months when more evidence came to light that supported this COVID-19 origin theory. Psaki claims 12 people were responsible for almost 65% of anti-vaccine disinformation on social media platform. That is obviously untrue. Are these 12 people tweeting thousands of times a day? If so, they are not people, they are bots. Psaki's claim was based on a finding that was reported in May by the Center for Countering Digital Hate, but Facebook has disputed the methodology. Surgeon General Murthy also raised concerns in a 22-page advisory titled Confronting Health Misinformation, released Thursday. On page 2, he wrote, I am urging all Americans to help slow the spread of health misinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. Health misinformation is a serious threat to public health. It can cause confusion, sow mistrust, harm people's health, and undermine public health efforts. Limiting the spread of health misinformation is a moral and civic imperative that will require a whole of society effort. Geez, sounds pretty totalitarian to me. On Monday, Politico reported that Biden allied groups, including the Democratic National Committee, plan to fact-check more aggressively. There are certain medicines that I'm not allowed to mention on Facebook, but we have increasing studies being released showing that these medicines that dare not be named, actually have efficacy. So what happens when the official medical opinion changes on that? Of course, it's possible that the guardians of public health may condemn or may have already condemned hundreds of thousands or millions of people to die because they didn't want to admit they made a mistake. And this is from Jeff Poor at Breitbart. Thursday on Fox News Channel special report, Senator Josh Hawley, Republican of Missouri, decried the federal government's efforts to instruct tech companies who to censor, which he deemed coordination between big government and monopolized big tech. Oh, I think it's scary, Brett, he said. I think it's really scary to have the federal government of the United States, the White House, compiling lists of people, organizations, whatever, and then going to a private company that, by the way, is a monopoly, Facebook, and saying, you need to censor. You need to do something about this. You need to tell these users, these private users on a private company, what they say or cannot say. I mean, I just think of this kind of coordination between big government and a big monopoly corporation. Boy, that is scary stuff. And it really is censorship, Brett. Hawley likened those activities to a function of a public utility and argued those companies should be broken up to restore competition. Well, at this point, you really have to wonder how private of companies they are, he said. I mean, if you're taking direction from the federal government, openly coordinating with the federal government, you have got the government saying, we think that this speech ought to be censored, and big tech, if they carry out these instructions, I mean, that looks like they're starting to operate as a public utility. I'm curious, I didn't think of this before. I wonder if David A. French, leading American conservative, has weighed in on this. I'm just going to scroll down. Okay, I'm going back 10 hours. I'm back 10 hours. Okay, I'm not seeing anything here. Not seeing anything here at all. Moderation is a oh, here we go. Here we go. And David A. French has not disappointed me. Psaki says if you're banned on one social media platform, you should be banned on every other social media platform. This from the First on TV. French responded, moderation is a platform decision, not a White House decision. Trying to force more moderation is as constitutionally problematic as trying to force less moderation. In other words, to hell with free speech if private companies decide to shut you up. This is conservatism, Inc. Let us go to the chat. Hello to Tricky Hoop, Palcasso 88, to Dan, Chogo King 666, Palcasso 88 says, subverting democracy, one mean tweet at a time. Thank you for your kind words, buddy. Hello to Caligula 138 and Oscar Toe. Hello to Yo Mama. Okay. Scrolling down. Brandon Smith says if Africa has a Chad, it's only a matter of time before some major city in flyover country must be named Shaniqua. Chokokin 666 said Chad is the Chad of African countries. They have turban-clad camel warriors. No, I was just reminded of a line in an Oberon Waugh novel about a troublesome, no, it's a A.N. Wilson novel. It was about a troublesome priest and of the traditionalist variety and what punishment for him. And someone says, well, you know, in the old days, we used to send people to a leper colony in Chad, or such people. Actually, that's what they would do. Yeah, so you're getting a little too big for your boots here. Let's see how you like it amongst the lepers. And who else do we have here? Oscar Toe says, Zuck gives the GOP orders too, but they already know they are Washington Generals to the DNC Globe Trotters. And I think that is French pulled through, said Dan. Yes, yes, indeed. I'm going to get to the hideously ugly Stephen Guilbeault soon enough. This is, okay, I've already covered Holly. Breaking. This is from the Post-Millennial today. Mia Cathell. White House Press Secretary Jen, again, not Jennifer, but Jen Psaki, signaled it's fine to censor Americans since the Biden administration is already, quote, in touch, unquote, with the media in a similar way. Just keep digging that hole, Jen. After she made comments Thursday about flagging Facebook posts on COVID-19 vaccine misinformation, Psaki said today, it shouldn't come as a surprise that we're in touch with social media, just like we're in regular touch with all of you and your media outlets about areas where we have concern, information that might be useful, information that may or may not be interesting to your viewers. You all make decisions just like social media platforms make decisions, even though they are a private sector company and different. But just as an example, is Jen Psaki admitting that the regime media in America is an arm of the Biden administration? It sure sounds like it, doesn't it? Psaki said that the Biden administration is regularly making sure social media platforms are aware of the latest narratives dangerous to public health that we and many other Americans are seeing across all of social and traditional media. We work to engage with them to better understand the enforcement of social media platform policies. Oh, so the White House is telling these companies, these are your policies, so you must do this, which of course is not censorship in any way and is not in any way Facebook acting as the propaganda arm of the Biden administration. We work to engage them to better understand the enforcement of social media platform policies, citing the false narratives that remain active out there flowing on the internet of COVID-19 vaccines causing infertility. I don't know about that, but they've certainly caused a lot of miscarriages, up to 88% from a baseline of 10. The troubling claim has been disproven time and time again, but still a persistent narrative that the White House demands big tech companies take steps to address the inaccurate, false information, Psaki said. Real Clear Politics reporter Philip Wegman then asked Psaki if Facebook has been as proactive as the Biden administration would like in terms of flagging the outlined content. Psaki stressed that it's the shared responsibility of members of the media, citizens, civic leaders, and trusted voices around the country, including social media sites, as sources of news and information for the public. A couple of steps that could be constructive for the public health of the country, Psaki said, are for Facebook to measure and share the impact of misinformation on the site and the audience it is reaching. She urged the purported free speech forums to create robust enforcement strategies that bridge properties and provide transparency about community guidelines. You shouldn't be banned from one platform and not others for providing misinformation out there, Psaki said. Yes, America is becoming East Germany so quickly that, well, the regime is certainly not noticing. This is from Alex Dalawal at Post-Millennial. Twitter posts are, quote, undermining Canada's democracy, unquote, said Canada's ho-ho, very satirical heritage minister, Stephen Guilbeault, in a briefing note, who was urging regulation of hurtful comments for a, quote, truly democratic debate, unquote. Cabinet on June 23rd introduced Bill C-36, an act to amend the criminal code, that threatens Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube users suspected of posting content that promotes detestation or vilification with house arrest or $70,000 fines. The Heritage Department promised public consultation on the bill. Quote, this content steals and damages lives. Steals lives. So it's kind of like a residential school of social media, is it? It intimidates and obscures valuable voices, preventing a truly democratic debate. What he's saying is that people who sling shit on social media are aghast and outraged that sometimes shit gets slung at them in return. And I'll have more on that in just a minute. Our objective is to ensure more accountability and transparency from online platforms while respecting the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Yes, and I will remind listeners once again that despite the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Supreme Court of Canada has ruled definitively that truth is not a defense to the accusation of having committed a hate crime. The mandate of the Department of Canadian Heritage includes the promotion of greater understanding of human rights. Yes, in Canada, human rights are the rights that the government gives you, and if you disagree with the government, you don't have any rights. Parliament in 1970 banned hate speech under the Criminal Code. Bill C-36 would expand the law to prohibit hurtful remarks without evidence any crime was committed. Quote, social media platforms such as Facebook or Twitter are increasingly central to participation in democratic, cultural, and public life. However, social media platforms can also be used to threaten, intimidate, bully, and harass people, or used to promote racist, anti-Semitic, ho-ho, very satirical, guibo, Islamophobic, misogynist, and homophobic views that target communities, put people's safety at risk, and undermine Canada's social cohesion or democracy. Yes, partisan politics could also be said to undermine Canada's social cohesion. You have all these different parties saying all these different things, and they're all in opposition to each other. Wouldn't it be better in terms of social cohesion if we had just one party in Canada? We effectively have just one party in Canada, but why not just make it official? Just have one party in Canada, and which party should that be? How about the party that gave us the maple leaf flag, and then it's made its party symbol a replica of the flag that it gave us? That would be the Liberal Party, wouldn't it? Yes, it seems that COVID-19 has become politics, which has become COVID-19, which has become misinformation, which has become disinformation, which has become suppressing free speech. It's a funny thing that a respiratory disease now becomes an excuse to extinguish all the rights that we took for granted. But perhaps not such a funny thing, because it appears, I don't know, people like Bill Gates and other worries have been working on such scenarios for quite a few years. William Briggs, a statistician to the stars, writes on his blogs today, models only say what they're told to the paper. The paper, more like a glorified note, really. Models only say what they're told to say, will appear in the Springer book, Prediction and Causality in Econometrics and Related Topics, shortly. He provides a PDF of the paper in advance, which you can find at his website, wmbriggs.com. There is also a Corona Doom example or two. The paper has a fraction of math in it, but anyone who paid attention in middle school would have no trouble with it. It is mostly, as with most of my professional work, a matter of philosophy. Now, on that subject, I want to clear up a misunderstanding some have about the necessarily true statement that all models only say what they're told to say. First, it is indeed necessarily true, the proof of which you can find in the paper, and I won't bore you with here. Second, it is neither good nor bad that all models only say what they're told to say. It is just the way things are. It also has no limitations on models or on our understanding of how the world works. Our understanding is models. Nevertheless, it serves as a pithy reminder to say all models only say what they're told to say when people are being terrorized by a model, as they were during the still lingering Corona Doom panic, and as they are in an increasing number of ways. Models can be good or bad. The ones we're terrorized with and called denier for doubting are the bad ones, which it is why to highlight the model is only saying what the builders wanted to say. Here is a press headline from a Minnesota news source, 13th May 2020. Updated model predicts COVID-19 peak in late July with SAHO extended through May 25,000 deaths possible. This was, of course, produced during the coronavirus panic. In previous briefings, Minnesota's Governor Tim Walz had asked Minnesotans not to focus on specific numbers, but rather focus on when the peaks might occur. Quote, modeling was never meant to provide a number. It was meant to show trend and direction that if you social distance, you buy more time, unquote. Briggs comments, this is false. And many similar comments made by numerous official sources during the panics were common. They were not only false, but misleading too. Enforced stay-at-home social distance working was an input to all of these models. We cannot therefore point to model output and say, at least with a straight face, see, the model says stay-at-home social distancing works, which is why we need to implement it. This mistake was made countless times during the crisis. This is detailed at length in the paper, including a discussion of how the World Health Organization made the same mistake based on a high school science project to conclude social distancing worked, when, as always, this was a premise of the model. The models reported on here were built saying social distancing reduces death. This assumption was an integral part of the models. It was not a discovery of the models, it was a condition of them. The models had to say social distancing worked because they started with the premise that social distancing worked. You cannot discover stay-at-home social distancing worked via any model, though it may be discovered via after-the-fact observation. You had to have built in that possibility in the first place. You knew in advance that it worked because that's what you told the model. You cannot run the model, wait for the output, run to your governor and say, the latest model says social distancing works. If your governor had any sense, he would say, didn't you write the model code? And didn't the code say somewhere that social distancing worked? The rush to embrace these models as if they were oracular says more about the goals and desires and decision makers during the panic than it says about model making. Oh, but wait, there's more. This is again from Mia Cathell at the Post Millennial. President Biden said Friday that social media platforms such as Facebook are killing people. And the only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated. Again, ho-ho, very satirical. A reporter asked Biden, what's your message to platforms like Facebook? The president replied, they're killing people. The only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated, and they're killing people. The presser erupted into chaos after Biden walked away from the crowd. Yes, the Nuremberg Code regarding medical experiments does not allow people to be coerced, bullied, etc., into accepting experimental medicines. Now, I will point out that the FDA-approved vaccines are experimental. They have not been given full approval, only emergency approval. And Biden started out by saying that the most patriotic thing that you can do is to be vaccinated. Now he's saying that you are an enemy of the state, that you are killing people if you don't get the vaccine. This is a clear violation of the Nuremberg Code. This is from Dan Diamond, Hannah Knowles, and Tyler Pager at the Washington Post. On July the 4th, President Biden celebrated dramatic progress in the war on the coronavirus, again with the military metaphor. With more than 150 million adults fully vaccinated and infections plunging 93% since Inauguration Day. Together, we're beating the virus, Biden said at a party on the White House lawn. But at the recent Conservative Political Action Conference, attendees celebrated a different, essentially opposite milestone that Biden had missed his goal of vaccinating 70% of adults. Clearly, the government was hoping that they could sort of sucker 90% of the population into getting vaccinated. He's an activist, is he? Alex Berenson told the crowd Saturday, seeming to inflate Biden's target, and it isn't happening. The crowd clapped and cheered at that failure. What began as vaccine hesitancy has morphed into outright vaccine hostility as conservatives increasingly attack the White House's coronavirus message, mischaracterize its vaccination campaign, and more vow to skip the shots altogether. The notion that the vaccine drive is pointless or harmful, or perhaps even a government plot, is increasingly an article of faith among supporters of former President Donald Trump, on a par with assertions that the last election was stolen and the assault on the U.S. Capitol was overblown. Well, given that the Americans most likely to refuse the virus are black, it would appear that Donald Trump, he must have got something like a super majority of black votes in November. Wait, that didn't happen. When you have a government which first says, encourages companies, hey, we'll give you a free burger and fries. We'll give you a free beer. We'll give you a free joint. We'll have lotteries for many thousands of dollars. We'll give you kiddies a free Xbox. And then they move to, you're an enemy of the state. You're killing people. This tends to inspire distrust in people. Every single person knows about the vaccinations, or the jabs, as they're more honestly called. So it's not a question of lack of information. No, it is a question of resistance. Again, there is the matter of risk versus benefits, which no one in the Biden administration has sought to look into or explain, and no one in the regime media has sought to look in and explain as well. Yes, we already talked about masks in LA County again. Oh, here we go. This is from Jayla Bernstein at CBC News. Outspoken health experts say racist social media attacks have taken a toll. Warning, this story contains offensive language and racist comments. Plenty of Canadians have experienced firsthand how quickly disagreements over public health measures during the pandemic can turn ugly. But a daily flood of hateful attacks received by outspoken medical professionals, especially those who are people of color, frequently cross the line from outrage to outright personal attacks, racism, and even threats of violence. As restrictions, yes, threats of violence. Trans men regularly make threats of violence against so-called TERFs, and they even act on this. But I don't see the CBC or any other members of the regime media crying about that. As restrictions ease across the country and active COVID-19 cases drop, Canadian doctors who took to social media during the crisis to share advice and correct misinformation say the hate they face online isn't going anywhere. In fact, it's stronger than ever. What I thought was bad in March 2020 has actually gotten worse now, said Dr. Amy Tan, a palliative care and family doctor in Victoria. When anti-Asian hate ramped up last year with the arrival of COVID-19 in North America, Tan said she was inspired to use social media as a platform to call out racism. She tweets about a range of topics, sharing her own experiences with racism, advocating for the use of masks, discussing vaccines, and commenting on social justice issues. So it doesn't appear that the good doctor merely, is spreading good information about COVID-19. Her social media presence means she's regularly the receiving end of misogyny, because whenever you criticize a woman, you're guilty of misogyny and racism from the trolls who send her direct messages, emails, and sometimes physical mail. I've actually asked my assistant to be careful and wear gloves when she opens mail that looks a little bit suspicious, because I have gotten physical hate mail, Tan said. One of the most hurtful comments she said came after she finished a live TV interview on Canada Day last year. I got an email to my work email and said, I'm an ugly G-G. And then my eyes were too tiny and then I needed to open up my eyes, she said. Yes. Well, how does she know that this email came from a real person? We learned after the English soccer fiasco, it turns out that the majority of these racist tweets directed at 3 English footballers came from bots in Asia. And it's not just racialized doctors. Again, the Han Chinese, they never knew themselves to be a race. Evil white people racialize them. It's not only racialized doctors have been under fire. Outspoken health advocates across Canada have been trolled, had their accounts hacked, and received threats. Dr. Nahid Dossani, palliative care physician. Palliative care. Okay. They seem to have a lot of acquaintance with death, these people. In a lecture at the University of Toronto, acknowledged most health professionals have dealt with quite a bit of hate during the pandemic. Health workers of all stripes have been targeted, but I think health workers who are people of color, racialized health workers who have been public, have been targeted especially in nasty ways, he said. When the crisis hit Canada, he continued to advocate on issues of racism and injustice, while also pivoting to raise awareness about physical distancing and masks. Yes, another private message sent to his Facebook account reads, quote, "If you don't like it here, how about you go back to that shithole you're from and see how far you get? Until that time, shut the F up." Oh, is that such an illegitimate comment? When someone from another country, or, is a member of a cohort from another country, comes here and spends a great deal of time telling us how awful we are and how our country stinks and always has, does Dr. Dossani not understand that this is liable to raise some backlash? Oh, here's a tweet from him. "Hey, indoor BBQ activists, you're not being oppressed. You're being inconvenienced. Learn the difference. Your threats will not stop me." Yes, the government of Ontario decided to strike at evil barbecue restaurants, and Dr. Dossani, "Oh, you stupid white people in your barbecue." But let's take a look. Let's take a look at these Twitter feeds from these brave, oppressed, racialized doctors who are only striving, to spread the truth, who have no political agenda whatsoever. And we'll start with Dr. Amy Tan. Okay. Yes, let's get to the racism stuff here. Racism, because you don't have to, disgusting exterior, this is just a retweet, okay. And she goes on, yes, thank you to Jayla Bernstein for covering the ugly racism in Canada. Yes, Canada is such a racist country that racialized people like you and Dr. Dossani somehow managed to rise to the position, professors at the University of Toronto. That's just how racist. To get to a better, less racist, less misogynist, less harmful place, we must talk about the truths in solidarity with every group facing oppression as our liberation is intertwined. So Dr. Tan needs to be liberated, does she? Perhaps Dr. Tan should read Amy Chua's book, World on Fire, where she learn a little bit more about market-dominant minorities. There's an article I'm going to get to called "Burn It All Down is a Call for Decolonization, Not Arson." A suggestion: condemn oppression rather than projecting outrage at outraged First Nations. This is a moment for real change, but we must all become wise to the ways these opportunities are derailed by power and indifferent bystanders. And she repeats, this is Dr. Tan, "Burn It All Down is a call for decolonization, not arson." Oh, here's another tweet from Dr. Tan, who is a completely apolitical person. She's merely a medical professional. As a Star Trek Next Generation fan, but of course, I had always joked as a kid that resistance is futile. I now know that resistance is a necessity. Won't let moral agency, integrity be compromised, must resist situations, structures, acts that are oppressive, harmful, unjust. So Dr. Tan would appear to be a revolutionary. How about that? Let's go to Dr. Nahid Dossani, who is a picture talking to some woman with blue and black hair. Oh, and he's wearing a baseball cap backwards, but tilted to the side. You see what a regular guy he is? Here's his pinned tweet. Racism is a public health emergency, in all caps, and that appears 7 times. What can we extrapolate from that? Who's guilty of racism? White people. What about others? No. Only white people can be guilty of racism. So if racism is a public health emergency, that means that white people are killing everyone else. That's a completely disinterested, apolitical comment from the tireless public servant, Dr. Naheed Dosani. You can call us racist names. You can send us hateful insults. You can target us with threats, but it won't stop health workers from speaking out every day about science, public health, and the need for justice for all Canadians. You can't stop this movement. Oh, I thought this was about public health, but apparently it is about revolution, burning it all down. That doesn't sound very anti-white at all. I don't know where I got that idea. Oh, yes. Some clown at the Tyee. Please advise, have politics driven us bonkers? Pro-plague Republicans, anti-green leader Greens, voters out for unvaccinated blood. Help, Dr. Steve. Help. And there's a bunch of rubbish about the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Big Bang Theory and Britney Spears and the obligatory reference to Einstein. And he quotes someone from Newsmax who's against vaccination of all kinds. And he conflates that with people who have their problems with the mRNA vaccines, which are, again, gene therapy. They're the same thing. You see, they are not the same thing, because these vaccines are not vaccines as traditionally understood. They are, again, experimental gene therapy. And more sports talk and Justin Trudeau's beard. And golly, what a regular guy he is, because he loves sports ball. I touched on this before, but it's useful to remind you. This is from CBC News. As children emerge from their homes after COVID-19 related lockdowns, common viruses that all but disappeared during the pandemic are reemerging too, doctors say. This time of year in pediatric hospitals is usually quiet, says Dr. Fatima Kakar, a pediatric infectious disease specialist at CHU Saint-Justine in Montreal, but now we're seeing a surge of respiratory infections. The level of non-COVID illness is what Kakar usually sees in the fall, she said, when people are out and about in daycares and schools. While the public health measures taken in the last year, including physical distancing, masking, and staying home, were used to stop the spread of COVID-19, they also had the side benefit of preventing other respiratory viruses, including colds, RSV, and human parainfluenza virus, which causes croup. Yes, Dr. Fatima Kakar. It's amazing, considering how very racist Canada is, that the medical profession seems to be increasingly dominated by Muslims and Chinese. I guess that will have to remain a mystery. This is from NBC News. Erica Edwards. COVID vaccines for kids under 12 expected midwinter, FDA officials says. After emergency use authorization, the agency hopes to move quickly to full approval. Good news. Good news. There will be no escape from 1 jab, 2 jab, 3 jabs, and more. But here is some conflicting news from the Jerusalem Post by Mayan Jaffe-Hoffman and Rosella Turcatin. The effectiveness of the Pfizer vaccine against the Delta variant, is weaker than health officials hoped, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said Friday, as 855 people tested positive for coronavirus and more countries were listed as places of high infection. We do not know exactly to what degree the vaccine helps, but it is significantly less, Bennett said. The Prime Minister held a meeting of top health officials and ministers to discuss the next steps for managing the virus in light of the numbers in Israel and what Bennett described as the Delta mutation leaping forward around the world, including in vaccinated countries such as Britain, Israel, and the U.S. Well, Israel is the most highly vaccinated, I was going to say civilized country, but I won't say that, industrialized country in the world. The Prime Minister said in Britain in recent days, we have seen a jump in the number of children who are being hospitalized on a daily basis. This is a development we are aware of. And, oh, yes, the vaccine works. The vaccine works. The vaccine works. Every time I look at the television, there's someone from the government of Canada or the state of Washington telling me the vaccine works, the vaccine works, the vaccine works. You've got to get the vaccine. This is from Spectrum Local News. Actually, it's from Associated Press. It's a reprint. The New York Yankees post-All-Star break opener against the Boston Red Sox Thursday night was postponed because of positive COVID-19 tests among vaccinated New York pitchers, Jonathan, Loistiga, and Nestor Cortez Jr. and Wandy Peralta. The general manager, Brian Cashman, said all three were fully vaccinated, as are most of the players on the team. Among the three, two received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and the other was either Pfizer or Moderna. Those players are doing well thus far, Cashman said, and that would speak again to the belief that those vaccinations are working and ultimately there to protect us from severe illness and or death. Cashman doesn't understand that the vaccine is not a treatment. It is not a palliative. It is a prophylactic. So if three fully vaccinated players on the New York Yankees have got COVID-19, this suggests that the vaccines are not so efficacious. This is from Citizens Free Press. The big, huge protests in Athens and Thessaloniki against lockdowns and actually vaccinations of teenagers, and a new Greek government policy barring unvaccinated from bars, restaurants, theaters, and other entertainment venues will take effect Friday and remain in place until at least August. Teens will be able to receive the vaccine starting Friday. And let's go to lockdown skeptics. U.S. medicines regulator will decide whether to fully approve the Pfizer COVID vaccine by January 2022. Bad news for Joe Biden, because it still remains emergency use experimental until January 2022. I suppose, Biden, his administration, or who's ever running the show, could, as they say in England, put the frighteners on the FDA, and I wouldn't put it past them. Government not planning to change sensitivity of NHS COVID app. Reports that the government, that is to say the English government, could lower the sensitivity of the NHS COVID app in weeks after 500,000 English people were pinged in just several days has been denied, with officials only going so far as to say the system will be kept under constant review. Up to 1.6 million people in England told to self-isolate in a single week, which may have something to do with the 500,000 people pinged by the NHS COVID app. When everyone started getting smartphones, did they think that there was going to be a day when your smartphone would say, you must go home immediately, self-isolate until further notice? Did they think that was going to Well, I suppose people thought at the time that smartphone was going to be used as a means of a totalitarian repression. I mean, it was inevitable, right? I mean, there's no escape from the smartphone. You could turn it off, but then people, perhaps your wife or your girlfriend or the government would say, why have you turned your phone off? What do you have to hide? Brits will, of course, face new lockdown if COVID situation becomes unacceptable, a government minister confirms. That would be Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty. Yes. And Freedom Day, which is supposedly 3 days away in England. It's illusory. That there's not going to be any freedom. And let's move on to Alex Berenson, the so-called activist, according to the Washington Post. Yes, son, I'm old enough to remember the day the White House proudly announced it was suppressing free speech. It was July the 15th, 2021. But they did let us have independence that year, so that was fun. Why? Why were they suppressing free speech? No, not a war. I mean, you think a war, right? But no, they were trying to make everyone take an experimental vaccine for an illness that 997 out of 1,000 people survive. No, great question, son. The experimental vaccine kind of worked. Not like real vaccines for measles and stuff, but kind of for a while, like months. It was hard to tell for how long because the clinical trials got messed up. Long story. Anyway, those were good times. Alex Berenson also tweets, it is not at all true that the only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated, even if Uncle Joe's advisors managed to stuff that sentence into his brain long enough for him to choke it out. But it is true that the only vaccine side effects we have are among the vaccinated. I don't know, the president of the United States to say something as blatantly as untrue as what he did. Hey, you ever heard of the New York Yankees? They're kind of famous. When things happen to the New York Yankees, it's national news. So 3 of their vaccinated players, 3, and there aren't that many players on a baseball team, come down with COVID. Did anyone, in your staff notice that? Or let's just suppress that information because it is not helpful. Attention citizens, Alex Berenson tweets, your Department of Pandemia is proud to introduce Panda Book, our new social media site. Lots of cat videos, plus all the news you need and none you don't. Sign up is voluntary. Attention citizens, all our sites are voluntarily closing immediately. Attention citizens, that's pronounced Panda Book because everyone loves pandas. But not everyone loves misinformation, especially not your Department of Pandemia. We love our information, and you should too. I'm going to be talking about Amy Chua's book in 30 minutes, World on Fire, approximately 30 minutes. Head McNeck, thank you for sending me this essay on Substack by Wesley Yang. It's called Welcome to Year Zero, a tentative beginning in a subdued key. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences of America announced last year that it would set diversity quotas for any film eligible to win a Best Picture award. In order to enforce these targets, there will be regular surprise inspections into the racial origins and gender identity of cast and crew. At the time of this, gender identity. Okay, I'm a white person, and I don't want to lose my job in Hollywood. What if these people just, told the inspectors that they were non-binary? Well, you don't look non-binary. What does that mean? I don't look non-binary. There's no possible response to that, is there? Well, forewarned is forearmed, as they say. At the time of this announcement, Yang writes, I joked on Twitter that such inspections would be ideal work, cushy, low risk. for former police officers from soon-to-be abolished, defunded, and/or reimagined departments. Defund police in order to fund racism police. Last year's joke is this year's policy. The Small Business Administration prioritized emergency COVID grants to restaurants by race. The Department of Agriculture prioritized funding to Black farmers. The state of Vermont allowed BIPOC residents early access to the vaccine. The state of California mandates diverse representation on corporate boards. San Francisco introduced a pilot public-private partnership program offering monthly cash payments reserved exclusively for Black and Pacific Islander women. Uber Eats offered free delivery from Black-owned restaurants. NASDAQ has proposed mandating diversity on the boards of the companies seeking to list on it. None of these are excesses of the anti-racist movement. They are the practical application of the principles laid out by the anti-racist texts that became required reading across corporate America during the racial reckoning of 2020. In the words of one of the two most required authors, Ibram X. Kendi, the only remedy of past discrimination is present discrimination. That's a quote. Some of these measures almost certainly violate the Constitution and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The courts brushed them back in certain cases and will likely continue to do so as challenges emerge. But that we enacted them is a victory for those seeking the drastic expansion of what they call race-conscious policy beyond the relatively constrained area in which affirmative action in college admissions, government contracting, and hiring has been allowed to operate. Among Biden's first acts in office was to issue an executive order that has been taken as a warrant by those keen to extend this mandate further into the provision of medical services by race and other areas to equalize outcomes wherever statistical disparities in outcome persist. Those disparities were henceforth to be understood as the product of a foundational, pervasive, transhistorical, and unyielding racism that can only be dislodged through the overt distribution of opportunity and reward by race in pursuit of equity, which has displaced mere equality as the aim of racial activism. Wesley Yang continues, the installation of these policies and the sea change in elite consensus that they enact happened with little public deliberation or debate. Instead, we saw the policing of contrary views out of circulation, first by administrative authorities at universities and later through broader campaigns to stigmatize the common moral intuitions of a supermajority of the American public. What were once held to be colorblind ideals of impartial treatment on the basis of individual attributes have been reclassified as a form of white supremacy on the pyramid of white supremacy presented as dogma in now pervasive diversity, equity, and inclusion training sessions. It took a decade or so for the theory of colorblind racism to move from academia to corporate America, and another half decade for it to be explicitly endorsed by the federal government. It amounts to a quiet overturning of the post-1964 racial consensus. Cancel culture, which has created a situation in which 62% of the American public told pollsters that they are afraid to share their political opinions, was always simply a means to an end, the noisy herald of a mandated adherence to new dogmas to come. The agenda is here today in the process of being rolled out at scale across a range of institutions, including K-12 schools. The means must therefore be judged in relation to the ends they have secured. They have already begun to transform the schools and to exert influence over law enforcement in ways that are changing the character of education and city life. How far this will go, what sorts of resistance it will meet in the courts and other venues, whether the institutional consensus around it will hold firm in the face of political resistance is all to be determined. What is not in dispute is that the federal government and other private entities have already crossed a Rubicon and signaled a willingness to defy legal precedent and public opinion in accordance with the ruling consensus of the new regime that they have thereby inaugurated. Wesley writes, I call this regime the successor regime. 2021 is its year zero. And he elucidates on this in the rest of the essay. And he promises that he's going, devote the Substack to the subject of year zero. A couple of thoughts. One, it turns out that the promise of colorblind society was a bait and switch. That, yes, it was never really a colorblind society because it had affirmative action, both public and private, built into it. But after a sufficient number of minorities were given positions in the elite, they leveraged this to demand the total surrender of the enemies, the dispossession of whites in the United States. Secondly, a fellow called Mark Tushnet, who was, I believe, a law professor, he's a professor of some sort, and the father of a woman who's allegedly called Eve Tushnet. I don't believe that name is real, but never mind. He wrote an essay. It was back when Hillary Clinton was going to become president, spelling all this out. The culture war is over. We've won. Time to shoot the wounded. It should not really come as a surprise to anyone. We have an essay called The Misinformation Hoax, and it's an American Mindset, which is yet another Substack. It's all happening on Substack, people. Everything you are about to read is obvious that it has to be spelled out as demonstrative of what's going wrong with America today. When it dawned on America's ruling faction that the digital technology they unleashed on us had risen to a level of dominance and control higher than their own, they were understandably upset. Nobody likes nasty surprises, especially embarrassing ones that take their legitimacy away. But the ruling faction is still unwilling to consider that the digital genie won't go back into the bottle. Nothing they do can undo the reversal of fortune they brought among themselves. Now, no single set of human ideas can be powerful enough to impose one unified thought system over all of digital technology. I wonder if that is true when they start jailing people, because they are going to start jailing people in Canada. People have already been jailed in Canada for the opinion, but this is going to be stepped up. Or they just issue ruinous fines. And of course, if you don't pay those fines, you get sent to jail. I mean, the system already exists where people are ruined socially. Now, I suppose, with enough burner phones and with enough access to servers in Kazakhstan or something, I suppose there are ways around this, but we shall see. The American mind continues. This is true at the global level, which is why autocracy and authoritarianism are on the rise in big countries with ancient civilizations. But it's especially true in America, where autocracy struggles to take hold because of the irreducible pluralism of our people and its reflection in our form of government. Unfortunately, over the last several generations of the pre-digital age, a form of autocracy did claim an important corner of our government. Since the Second World War, the development of technology in America was effectively captured by the military-industrial complex and the intelligence community. Read complex. With functionally infinite budgets and no oversight or outside restraint, our masters of militarized technology reorganized American ingenuity around the idea that engineers of sufficient virtue and power should preempt and insulate their actions from political decision-making. The initial populist reaction against this usurpation of power incompatible with our form of government came from the left. The essence of 60s radicalism was horror and disgust toward the idea that the logic of instrumental power was fated and inescapable, making all complicit in its march toward the end of political agency. But as Thomas Pynchon and among numerous others in the counterculture made painfully clear, the populist anti-establishment project rapidly failed as too many radicals were quickly compromised by the intoxicating sensation of absolute power, even at the smallest interpersonal levels. A personal note, when I first signed on or registered for my university classes at the University of BC in 1973, we were given all of these IBM punch cards, which had our choices for classes on them or whatever. And I realized something, because I'd heard of this slogan for several years before. This do not fold, spindle, or mutilate. This was seen to be sinister. That punch cards, we're going to become the slaves of punch cards. Those were innocent days, weren't they? The American mind continues. What emerged from this disillusioning disaster was a new countercultural ideal, one not of attacking power or escaping power, but purifying it. The ultimate purpose of the long march through the institutions was to beat the global military intelligence complex's swords into plowshares that could redeem the world. Perhaps the Überwaffen of the bomb was too difficult to discard and repurpose into safely ennobling technology, but surely the new wonder weapons of the computer and the internet could be turned to good, even utopian effect. Engineers of sufficient virtue and power could triumph over the darkness and errancy of politics after all. Well, obviously it's a big challenge, isn't it? Every day I get about 10 spam and phishing messages, maybe more than that, telling me there is something wrong with my Microsoft email account and that I need to change the password or I need to do this or that. And it's telling me that my Microsoft email has been shut down. And I learned long ago not to open any of those messages, but apparently governments have been unable to stop this spam, which is, we found in the embarrassment that the Democratic National Committee suffered in 2016, that a very high-ranking fellow decided to open up a phishing email, and thus his communications were revealed to the world. Actually, this is James Poulos is the author of this essay. And I'll just leave it at that and commend it to you. Again, the American Mindset at Substack.com. And oh, yes, let's talk about the most dangerous woman in America. And it's not who you might think. This is from Spencer Bakuli at Bounding into Comics. The American Booksellers Association has issued to the trans community an apology for a self-described serious violent incident in which they recommended Abigail Schreier's transgender book, critical book. Sorry, that's a spelling error in the text. It should say transgender, not transtrender. Irreversible Damage, the transgender craze seducing our daughters, to members of their organization. Published to their official Twitter account July 14th, the ABA's apologetic statement explained that, quote, an anti-trans book was included in our July mailing to members, unquote, and asserted that the promotion of the unnamed book was both, quote, a serious violent incident that goes against ABA's policies, values, and everything we believe and support, and is inexcusable. We apologize to our trans members and to the trans community for this terrible incident and the pain we caused them. We also apologize to the alphabet people community at large and to our bookselling community. So many communities. Assuring their fans that they believed apologies are not enough, the ABA further informed its members and followers that they had begun addressing this today and are committed to engaging in the critical dialogue needed to inform concrete steps. I love that. To address the harm we cause, which would be shared in the next 3 weeks. I'm seething, wrote one trans bookseller, Casey Morrissey, in a tweet made following their own personal reception of the ABA's mailing. I was excited to open our July white box, and then the first book I pulled out is Irreversible Damage. Do you know how that feels as a trans bookseller and book buyer? It isn't even a new title. So it really caught me in the gut. Do better. Why do they all sound like that? Why does every one of these people sound like that? So here we have a tweet from the aforementioned Wesley Yang, who's been paying close attention to this ABA controversy. And apologies are not enough. Yes, says the American Booksellers Association, and endless tweets. And a story from Hannah Sparks, or the headline from Hannah Sparks in the New York Post, July the 15th. Shark advocates call for rebranding violent attacks as interactions. Yang comments, the sovereign is he who defines the meaning of violence. Just so. The Wall Street Journal editorialized against the attempted suppression of Abigail Shrier's excellent book. You should all buy it. And points out that Schreier supports medical gender transitions for adults and opposes discrimination against trans individuals. Her justifiable concern is with adolescent girls who have shown no childhood history of gender dysphoria and who might later regret a decision that alters their bodies in fundamental ways. Amazon had quit selling the book. There were complaints. It's selling it again. Target, however, refuses to sell Abigail Shrier's books. That may or may not inform your future shopping decisions. Again with the winks and the nods about burning Christian churches in Canada. This is by Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, Shiri Pasternak, Audrey Huntley, and Megan Daniel. It took 4 people to write this. Shiri Pasternak is a professor at X University, August Institution, and a member of the Anti-Colonial Committee of the Law Union of Ontario. Audrey Huntley is a licensed paralegal at Aboriginal Legal Services and the co-founder of No More Silence. Megan Daniel is a settler lawyer whose practice focuses on the issues facing Indigenous peoples, communities, and governments. Burn it all down is a call for decolonization, not arson, a suggestion. Condemn oppression rather than projecting outrage at outraged First Nations. I don't know that there was much outrage against First Nations because of this burning of these churches. The elite view, and the elite view from everyone, even my old colleague Kelly Torrance, residential schools, the horror, etc., etc. Yes, as this essay says, a wave of emotion has swept through social media. People have expressed profound sadness and grief, a numb recognition of known truths, and of course, overwhelming anger. Accompanying these strong reactions, something has also begun to change. The horror and shock have turned to newfound acceptance by some resistant Canadians that genocide had been the right word all along. It's a funny kind of genocide, once again, when the number of Native Indians in Canada circa 1900 is this, and circa 2021 is this. That is not my understanding of genocide. But, oh yes, status quo suits a lot of people's interest. There will always be people who rush into the waves of social change to try to pull the tide back. There is no tide in history. There is no tide in social change. Let's take a look at Colin Kaepernick, because he's really relevant to consideration of Native Indians in Canada, and particularly of their history. What does deflection look like? Colin Kaepernick took a knee at NFL football games in protest of police brutality and the killings of Black people by the police in America. He captured people's faux outrage against him in a shirt. We march, y'all mad. We sit down, y'all mad. We speak up, y'all mad. We die, y'all silent. Likewise, the current uproar around BC Civil Liberties Association Executive Director Harsha Walia, who comes born in the Gulf and somehow found her way to horrible racist Canada. She tweeted to burn it all down in response to a news report of 2 churches burning amid reports of more unmarked graves found is more pearl clutching. Burn it all down is part of a lexicon of social movements going back 2 centuries. As historian Sean Carlton notes, this phrase signals, quote, not the ignition of actual literal fires, because revolutionaries have never set actual literal fires. People who say burn it all down never follow through. Right, Professor Carlton? Rather, drawing on that long tradition of that phraseology, it means burning down the structures of injustice to create better futures. Okay, my sympathy with the Native Indians of my country, which was once pretty substantial, is now officially vanished. They have decided to make a common cause with the enemies of Canada. In fact, they want to destroy Canada. So again, they can get along without my sympathy. Barry Weiss, again at her Substack, it's where it's going on, has a piece, A Witch Trial at the Legal Aid Society. Maud Marin was a model public defender. Then she was forced out of her job because of her political views and her race. If you Google Bleeding Heart Liberal, Maud Marin might well turn up as the first hit. Yes, Planned Parenthood, etc., student of Kathleen Cleaver, blah, 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 blah. And now she's in trouble because she's not on board with critical race theory. And she published a piece in the New York Post. I don't know if Maud Marin is Jewish. It is a common Jewish name in the United States, or that is it is a name that quite a few Jews have in the United States, Marin. But I'm not. Blacks in New York City for some time have made it clear that they hate Jews and they mean to hurt them. And I don't think that Barry Weiss's liberalism is much use in this respect, because make no mistake, they want a race war. This is from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. Sadiq Khan says new statue of activist reflects London's achievements and diversity. London Mayor Sadiq Khan defended the impending placement of a statue of John Chilembwe, an anti-colonial activist who ordered the decapitation of William Livingston in front of his children and then displayed his head on a pike, saying it served to reflect London's achievements and diversity. Again, they want a race war. And it's good to know that the police of the West Midlands, not so interested in knife crime, not so interested in grooming gangs, but focusing on the crime that's really important. Again, from Paul Joseph Watson. A police force in the UK faced criticism after it bragged on Twitter about arresting a 12-year-old boy. A quote from WMP, "We were alerted to a series of racist messages sent to a footballer today, and we were looking into them and conducting checks. We have arrested a boy. The 12-year-old from Solihull has been taken to custody. Thanks to everyone who raised it. Racism won't be tolerated." Again, knife crime, not so important. Grooming gangs, not so important. Mean tweets, the most important. Thanks to a correspondent who sent me this story. This is from barenakedislam.com, July the 15th. Radical Somali Muslim candidate running for office in Seattle who threatened to blow up a school bus filled with children gets endorsement of the transit union. Eubanks Gardhere, the embattled far-left county council candidate who threatened to blow up a school bus filled with children, has been endorsed by a radical activist transit union whose logo is, ironically, a bus. She boarded a Highline School District bus full of children in January 2010 and threatened to blow it up with a bomb. Gardhere called the children cowards as they fled in fear. The Transit Riders Union is well known in Seattle for being activist foot soldiers for radical causes and Marxist candidates like Seattle Council member Kashama Sawant. The TRU announced the endorsement after national attention was brought to Gardhere's past, and a video of the incident itself, it's on video, was published by the Post Millennial. Again, they want a race war. And the people of Seattle apparently are willing to be sacrificed thereby. But here's some good news. It's not all blackpilling on the KMG show. This is from Sandra Salath at the Daily Mail. NFL announces it will play the Black National Anthem before the Star-Spangled Banner during every week one game, and players may feature names of brutality victims on their helmets. I'm reminded of a quarterback on the Super Bowl winning Chicago Bears got into enormous trouble. Jim McMahon was his name. Enormous trouble because he had some sort of little message on his jersey or his helmet, and he was ordered to stop doing this. And then he put the name Roselle, who was the commissioner at the time, and he got even bigger threats. But no, the NFL has decided that it wants to go out of business. And again, I used to be a big NFL fan, and I don't care anymore. I've stopped watching it years ago. Oh, let's talk about year zero and the succession. This is from Time Magazine. Time 2030. Apparently something is planned for 2030. Does anyone know what it might be? I think it might have something to do with the World Economic Forum. But this is presented by Cisco, the bridge to possible. Air conditioning feels great, but it's terrible for the planet. Here's how to fix that. Yes, let's destroy industry in, say, the south of the United States, the southeast of the United States, because there was no industry there to speak of before the Second World War and the introduction of air conditioning. But it's bad people who live in the old Cotton South. So let's let them drown in their sweat. Okay, I just, again from the Tyee, which I knew years ago is kind of an old lefty labor-affiliated publication in British Columbia, and it is gone hard social justice warrior now. Too slow, too small, critics pan BC's safe supply plan. Government proposes to increase access to alternatives to toxic drugs over the next 2 years. The good news is that you're not getting toxic heroin anymore. The bad news is we're just going to give you 100% pure heroin because there are no known health hazards to heroin use. 6 years into the toxic drug public health emergency that has worsened during the COVID-19 pandemic, the BC government announced it will expand access to prescribed alternatives to drugs available on the legal market. I should point out that heroin is much less toxic than it was a generation or two ago. It's much less toxic. That is to say, it is more pure and is much less expensive than it was. In fact, the illegal stuff is pure enough so that it is not necessary to inject it anymore. That is to say, one can get the high that one previously got from injecting, simply from snorting the stuff. The federal government of Canada says that it has no plans to legalize all drugs in Canada, but it has legalized. And the media has decided to completely ignore this. Quelle surprise. Some of you may remember, particularly if you're fans of the director John Frankenheimer, a movie that he made in 1964 called 7 Days in May. A lot of star power there. It's got Burt Lancaster, Kirk Douglas, Frederick March, and Ava Gardner. And it is the film version. The script was by Rod Serling of Twilight Zone fame, of a novel from 1962 called 7 Days in May by Charles Bailey and Fletcher Nebel, which was a huge bestseller. The plot of the novel and the movie is this: that a bunch of high-ranking generals are very unhappy with the civilian leadership of the United States of America. Apparently, it's not anti-communist enough, so they decide a coup. There has to be a coup. Things are simply too serious for the civilians to run things, that the experts, the generals, must run things. And it's as close as this as to whether they succeed. But in that iteration of this plot, the generals were the villains. I mean, how dare they? What the MacArthur firing demonstrated once and for all is that it's the civilians that make the decisions and not the generals. But wait, those weren't woke generals. This is from New York Magazine's Intelligencer. Top U.S. general said Trump preached gospel of the Fuhrer. General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, likened Donald Trump's effort to hold on to power after the 2020 election to Adolf Hitler, saying the president was preaching the gospel of the Fuhrer with his lies about the election being stolen, according to a new book by two Washington Post reporters. And apparently, Milley decided that Trump was not going to succeed in his efforts to overturn, if you will, the election by whatever means. They may try, but they're not going to fucking succeed, Milley said. You can't do this without the military. You can't do this without the CIA and the FBI. We're the guys with guns. So what does this mean? Does this mean that if various courts, including the Supreme Court of the United States, had decided to hear any of these claims against election fraud, that Milley would have instituted a military coup? Milley was disturbed by the sight of Trump supporters rallying to his cause in November, calling them brown shirts in the streets. Leonagan Rucker wrote that Milley believed Trump was stoking unrest, possibly in the hopes of an excuse to invoke the Insurrection Act and call out the military. The general likened the U.S. to Germany's fragile Weimar Republic in the early 1930s. This is a Reichstag moment, he said. Whoa. This is one general who doesn't seem to know his place. And Tucker Carlson had something to say about this. This is from Ariel Zilber at the Daily Mail and the Associated Press. Carlson called on President Biden to fire Joint Chiefs Chairman General Mark Milley after the country's most senior military officer described how he vowed to stop then-President Donald Trump from carrying out a coup. Milley, Carlson said, compared half our country to Adolf Hitler. Think about that. Your grandfather joined the U.S. military to risk his life fighting the Nazis. Now the head of the U.S. military calls you a Nazi for having your grandfather's political views. What do you think about that? Milley's reported comments were excerpted by CNN, which previewed next week's release of the book, I Alone Can Fix It, Donald J. Trump's Catastrophic Final Year. Milley also said that he was planning to move against Trump if he did things that were ill-considered. Ill-considered. And apparently that is in his remit, to seize the government of the United States if the president, elected by the people, does something that he, General Milley, considers to be ill-considered. You might recall that back in 2017, there were various stories saying that, top generals in the United States, Joint Chiefs of Staff, had, let it be known that, Trump had better, watch his step, because there's certain things that we won't put up with. And I'm going to move to the book club very shortly. Let's have one last item before I do. Prosecutor investigating Hunter Biden waited until after the election to issue search warrants and grand jury subpoenas out of fear tax probe would become public and turn into a campaign issue. All of the threats against Trump, all of the legal threats against Trump, all of the rumors of legal threats against Trump, no, they couldn't possibly influence an election. Could they? Of course, this is Delaware's U.S. Attorney David Weiss, and of course, Delaware is one of the most corrupt places in the United States of America. People always carry on about Arkansas, but there's not a lot of money in Arkansas, and there is an enormous amount of money in Delaware. It's a place where one of the DuPonts can get a slap on the wrist from Biden's sainted dead son for raping a child because he's a DuPont, and the DuPonts are royalty in Delaware. So let's move on to actually, I'm going to check on the chat before I move on to the book club. And let me just open the book that we're going to talk about, and then I'll go to the chat. Here we go. Anonymous professor says, I base my life on the teachings of Kyle Rowland. I haven't heard anything about that fellow since I stopped being on Luke's show. What was that, a year and a half ago? How's he doing, by the way? I had a certain fondness for the fellow, I must say, in all honesty. Contra Cruz says watching KMG absolutely dismantle Kyle's arguments night after night was entertaining in its own ways. Polygon says Maryland tops Delaware in terms of corruption. Leponius Maximus Meridius says, I'm very proud that I triggered Kyle countless times. Anran says, you did indeed. Maryland is no good for sure, bro, says Don Willis. Kyle scored some points, but of course I agreed with Kevin Farmeroff and says Anran. He joined the Brookings Foundation, says Chokin 666. It's the Brookings Institution, isn't it? Isn't it? Anran says, at least Maryland has a great flag. People sure like to talk about the old days. Okay. Wow. A lot of stuff about Kyle. Is General Milley in the alphabet people community, says Oscar Toe? Not to my knowledge. Okay, let's go into it here. The book that I'm talking about is by Amy Chua, who is a professor at Yale Law School. For how long? We don't know. Things do not look good for her there, or for her husband. A World on Fire was originally published in 2002. The version that I have has an addendum to it, which takes up some later events. The subtitle is How Exporting Free Market Democracy Breeds Ethnic Hatred and Global Instability. Amy Chua was born in 1962 to Champaign, Illinois, to ethnic Chinese parents. This is from Wikipedia, with Hoklo ancestry, who emigrated from the Philippines. Her parents raised her speaking Hokkien. Her father is a professor of electrical engineering and computer science at UC Berkeley. So she has written 5 books, 2 studies of international affairs, a parenting memoir, which is the notorious battle hymn of the Tiger Mother, a book on ethnic American culture and its correlation with socioeconomic success in the United States, and a book about the role of tribal loyalties in American politics and foreign policy. Chua has recommended a large number of candidates that have gone on to clerk for Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Previously a prominent federal judge on the D.C. Circuit, controversy has arisen from allegations that Chua groomed potential clerks for the job by advising them to dress and act a certain way so as to secure employment with Kavanaugh. Given that that newly graduated law students would, I don't know, fight each other to the death, maybe in public, for the chance to clerk for a federal judge or a Supreme Court justice, this scandal about Chua giving advice on to women on how to dress and how to act is absolutely hilarious. And Chua is in big trouble. And apparently, she was having students over to her place, and alcohol was consumed or some such. That's the charge, which she denies. Her husband, Jed Rubenfeld, is also he's suspended because of a sexual harassment investigation. Look, there's no doubt in my mind that Rubenfeld was suspended because he's married to Amy Chuma, and Amy Chuma is in trouble because she is known to be friendly with Brett Kavanaugh. And of course, if any of these clowns at Yale Law had read World on Fire, that would be sufficient for them to want to destroy her, because Amy Chua is admirably honest and forthright on the role of race in the world. It is terribly, terribly important. She begins with a absolutely horrifying true story. One beautiful blue morning of September 1994, I received a call from my mother in California. In a hushed voice, she told me that my Aunt Leona, my father's twin sister, had been murdered in her home in the Philippines, her throat slit by her chauffeur. My mother broke the news to me in our native Hokkien Chinese dialect. But murder, she said in English, as if to wall off the act from the family through language. The murder of a relative is horrible for anyone anywhere. My father's grief was impenetrable to this day. He has not broken his silence on the subject. For the rest of the family, though, there was an added element of disgrace. For the Chinese, luck is a moral attribute, and a lucky person would never be murdered. Like having a birth defect or marrying a Filipino, being murdered is shameful. My three younger sisters and I were very fond of my Aunt Leona, who was petite and quirky and had never married. Like many wealthy Filipino Chinese, she had all kinds of bank accounts in Honolulu, San Francisco, and Chicago. She visited us in the United States regularly. She and my father, Leona and Leon, were close as only twins can be. Having no children of her own, she doted on her nieces and showered us with trinkets. As we grew older, the trinkets became treasures. On my 10th birthday, she gave me 10 small diamonds wrapped up in toilet paper. My aunt loved diamonds and bought them by the dozen, concealing them in empty Elizabeth Arden face moisturizer jars, some right on her bathroom shelf. She liked accumulating things. When we ate at McDonald's, she stuffed her Gucci purse with free ketchups. According to the police report, my Aunt Leona, a 58-year-old single woman, was killed in her living room with a butcher's knife at approximately 8 p.m. on September 12, 1994. Two of her maids were questioned and confessed that Nilo Abik, my aunt's chauffeur, had planned and executed the murder with their knowledge and assistance. A few hours before the actual killing, respondent was seen sharpening the knife allegedly used in the crime. After the killing, respondent joined the two witnesses and told them that their employer was dead. At that time, he was wearing a pair of bloodied white gloves and was still holding a knife, also with traces of blood. But Abik, or Abike, I don't know how it's pronounced, the report went on to say, had disappeared with the warrant for his arrest outstanding. The two maids were released. Meanwhile, my relatives arranged a private funeral for my aunt in the prestigious Chinese cemetery in Manila, where many of my ancestors are buried in a great white marble family tomb. According to the feng shui monks who were consulted, because of the violent nature of her death, my aunt could not be buried with the rest of the family, else more bad luck would strike her surviving kin. So she was placed in her own smaller vault next to, but not touching, the main family tomb. After the funeral, I asked one of my uncles whether there had been any further developments in the murder investigation. He replied tersely that the killer had not been found. His wife explained that the Manila police had essentially closed the case. I could not understand my relative's matter-of-fact, almost indifferent attitude. Why were they not more shocked that my aunt had been killed in cold blood by people who worked for her, lived with her, saw her every day? Were they not outraged that the maids had been released? When I pressed my uncle, he was short with me. That's the way things are here. This is the Philippines, not America. My uncle was simply not being callous. As it turns out, my aunt's death is part of a common pattern. Hundreds of Chinese in the Philippines are kidnapped every year, almost invariably by ethnic Filipinos. Many victims, often children, are brutally murdered even after ransom is paid. Other Chinese, like my aunt, are killed without a kidnapping, usually in connection with a robbery. Nor is it unusual that my aunt's killer was never apprehended. The policemen in the Philippines, all poor ethnic Filipinos themselves, are notoriously unmotivated in these cases. When asked by a Western journalist why it is so frequently the Chinese who are targeted, one grinning Filipino policeman explained that it was because they have more money. My family, Amy Chua writes, is part of the Philippines' tiny but entrepreneurial, economically powerful Chinese minority. Just 1% of the population, Chinese Filipinos, control as much as 60% of the private economy, including the country's 4 major airlines and almost all the country's banks, hotels, shopping malls, and major conglomerates. My own family in Manila runs a plastics conglomerate. Unlike Taipan's Lucio Tan, Henry C., or John Gogok, my relatives are only third-tier Chinese tycoons. Still, they own swaths of prime real estate and several vacation homes. They also have safe deposit boxes full of gold bars, each one roughly the size of a Snickers bar, but strangely heavy. I myself have such a bar. My Aunt Leona Federal expressed it to me as a law school graduation present a few years before she died. Since my aunt's murder, one childhood memory keeps haunting me. I was 8, staying at my family's splendid hacienda-style house in Manila. It was before dawn, still dark. Wide awake, I decided to get a drink from the kitchen. I must have gone down an extra flight of stairs because I literally stumbled onto 6 male bodies. I had found the male servants' quarters, my family's houseboys, gardeners, and chauffeurs. I sometimes imagine that Nilo Abik was among these men who were sleeping on mats on a dirt floor. The place stank of sweat and urine. I was horrified. Later that day, I mentioned the incident to my Aunt Leona, who laughed affectionately and explained that the servants, there were perhaps 20 living on the premises, all ethnic Filipinos, were fortunate to be working for our family. If not for their positions, they would be living among rats and open sewers without even a roof over their heads. A Filipino maid then walked in. I remember that she had a bowl of food for my aunt's Pekingese. My aunt took the bowl but kept talking as if the maid were not there. The Filipinos, she continued in Chinese, but plainly not caring whether the maid understood or not, were lazy and unintelligent and didn't really want to do much else. If they didn't like working for us, they were free to leave any time. After all, my aunt said, they were employees, not slaves. Nearly 2/3 of the roughly 80 million ethnic Filipinos in the Philippines live on less than $2 a day. 40% spend their entire lives in temporary shelters. 70% of all rural Filipinos own no land. Almost a third have no access to sanitation. But that's not the worst of it. Poverty alone never is. Poverty by itself does not make people kill. To poverty must be added indignity, hopelessness, and grievance. In the Philippines, millions of Filipinos work for Chinese. Almost no Chinese work for Filipinos. The Chinese dominate industry and commerce at every level of society. Global markets intensify this dominance. When foreign investors do business in the Philippines, they deal almost exclusively with Chinese. Apart from a handful of corrupt politicians and a few aristocratic Spanish mestizo families, all of the Philippines' billionaires are of Chinese descent. By contrast, all menial jobs in the Philippines are filled by Filipinos. All peasants are Filipinos. All domestic servants and squatters are Filipinos. In Manila, thousands of ethnic Filipinos used to live on or around the Payatas garbage dump, a 12-block-wide mountain of fermenting refuse known as the Promised Land. By scavenging through rotting food and dead animal carcasses, the squatters were able to eke out a living. In July 2000, as a result of accumulating methane gas, the garbage mountain imploded and collapsed, smothering over 100 people, including many young children. When I asked an uncle about the Payatas explosion, he responded with annoyance. Why does everyone want to talk about that? It's the worst thing for foreign investment. I wasn't surprised. My relatives live literally walled off from the Filipino masses in a posh, all-Chinese residential enclave on streets named Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and Princeton. Their entry points are guarded by armed private security forces. Each time I think of Nilo Abik, he was close to 6 feet and my aunt was 4'11" tall, I find myself welling up with a hatred and revulsion so intense it is actually consoling. But over time, I've also had glimpses of how the Chinese must look to the vast majority of Filipinos, to someone like Abik, as exploiters, as foreign intruders, their wealth inexplicable, their superiority intolerable. I will never forget the entry in the police report for Abik's motive for murder. The motive given was not robbery, despite the jewels and money the chauffeur was said to have taken. Instead, for motive, there was just one word: revenge. I have a similar story. It's a secondhand story. It's not nearly as dramatic as the one that Amy Chua tells, but it's a story that really informed my worldview and went a long way to persuading me that my views about the world, my liberal views about the world, were, well, mistaken. The first permanent job that I had at the University of British Columbia, I started in the spring of 1974 when I was 18 years old. And my boss at the biomedical library was Chinese from Malaysia. He had a Spanish surname because his grandfather had been a Spaniard. Now, I found out by degrees that this fellow, his name was John, he had been chief medical inspector for the province of Borneo. So what was he doing shelving books in a library in Vancouver? Well, the Chinese are the market-dominant minority in Malaysia, and Amy Chua has a lot to say about this in World on Fire. Well, the Malays do not like this, and in the late 1960s, they began to rebel. There was the famous incident of an airplane being exploded. There were attacks on Chinese, over 100 of them killed in a frenzy. And so my boss decided that it was time to get out while the going was good. So he came to Canada. He was initially placed in Kamloops, he told me, and he drove around and didn't see any Chinese people there. And so he and his family, his wife and two daughters, they drove to Vancouver, and where there are lots of Chinese people even then. I once asked him, I should say that he constantly mentioned to me, kind of reminder of the man that he once was, of all the various certificates that he had from Cambridge University. And I once asked him, did he ever regret, leaving a position of a high civil servant to shelve books in Canada? He said he didn't regret it at all, because he didn't want to live in a country where people wanted to kill him because of his race. Now, John would tell me all of these stories about Malaysia, including a particularly horrifying one, where one of his brothers, it was a Catholic family and large, they were living in an apartment with a concrete floor, and it was Christmas Day. So they decorated the tree on Christmas Day. And so it was one of his brothers got the treat of plugging in the lights. And he got a severe electric shock from this, so severe that his head was dashed to the concrete floor, and there he died on Christmas Day in front of his family. But John liked to talk about the other peoples of Malaysia, and he did not like them. And he didn't attempt to hide this. Perhaps not understanding that's not the sort of talk that's really entertained in Canada. He talked about the Malays, who of course are the original people, the majority in Malaysia. And there was a Malay woman that was working at the biomedical library. And of course, University of British Columbia was and presumably is still kind of a United Nations. I think pretty much every nation is represented there. And he would see this Malay woman dressing a kind of variation of her traditional Malay costume. And this would set him off on the Malays. The Malays, he told me many, many times, were lazy, sensual, and hypocritical. That they were jealous of the Chinese because the Chinese were smart and hard workers and looked to the future. And the Sikhs, he did not like the Sikhs at all. The Sikhs are about 8% of the population of Malaysia. The Sikhs were the hired muscle of the British Empire, and the British Empire brought them everywhere in Asia and in the Pacific. He told me this many, many times with a big smile on his face. He'd say, "Kevin, we have a saying in Malaysia, sooner trust a snake in the grass than trust an Indian." All this was a tremendous shock to me, because I thought the peoples of the world, the rest of them, they all love each other. It's only white people who suffer from racial prejudice. Of course, I saw many other examples of this at the University of British Columbia. For instance, you don't want a Croat and a Serb working in close proximity. No, you do not want that. And as I say, many, many other examples. It is the thesis of this Amy Chua's book that market-dominant minorities, which exist all over the world, are hated by the majorities, viscerally hated. Yes, it may be true that the majorities are harder working and smarter and have better time preferences, But when you see a small minority who are fabulously rich and you are fabulously poor, destitute, living in garbage, it's rather natural to hate them. And I have to say that the argument that she makes applies to, well, just generalized poverty. I've just been sickened for decades by this argument made by, well, Conservatism Inc., particularly by libertarians, that, oh, we talk about poor people in Canada or the United States, but they're not really poor. Well, what do you mean they're not really poor? Oh, well, they're not starving, and they have Blu-ray players, and they have computer screens, and they have smartphones. Oh, okay, yes, all this is true. But then they look around at other people, particularly, in recent years, when the 1% has decided to throw caution to the winds and simply revel in their enormous wealth and rub it in the faces of people who have so much less. This argument, oh, these poor people in Canada and the United States, they're not really poor. Well, what are we comparing them to? People who live in, say, Tanzania? Relative status is one of the most important things in the world. Chua describes it at great length, the extent to which the Chinese will dominate Southeast Asia, not just the Philippines, but in Indonesia and in Burma and elsewhere. And you see the same problems in all of these places, and these problems are exacerbated by two factors. The first is, well, we'll say democracy. Everyone loves democracy, right? Democracy is the best. Well, the problem with democracy is that to the extent that it represents ethnicity, it means that the market-dominant minorities are going to live under the rule of the majority. Now, typically how this ends up in so many cases, the Philippines was a good example. Ferdinand Marcos, he was utterly beholden to the Chinese in the Philippines, and he got paid off. Now, his wife, Imelda, got paid off even more. She became one of the richest women in the world. And you see this in Burma as well, where the Slork regime beholden to the Chinese. And the generals, they made out like bandits. Now, the people might have thought, oh, that, our people are in charge now, so perhaps our situations will become better vis-a-vis the rich. That is not what happens. The other thing that is going on is the free market. Yes, we need to unleash the free market. Unleashing the free market means that traditional supports, tariffs and the like, and other advantages given to those people who have lost the race of life, they get swept away, because you can't put any barriers in front of the free market. And what this does is simply to exacerbate the enormous differences in wealth between the poor and the wealthy. And frequently, as Amy Chua explains with regard to, well, bean curd in Indonesia, it wipes out traditional livelihoods, completely wipes them out. When capital is global, when capital can come from anywhere, what that means is that tradition is destroyed, because tradition cannot compete against trillions and trillions of dollars of foreign capital. And people seem to be, well, the elite seems to be discombobulated by these rages of ethnic hatred around the world. And I gather that's because, I would guess it's because they don't really think about the world very much, to the extent that they either believe that everyone in the world is just like them. Of course, our elite never considers the possibility, and Amy Chewett does talk about relative levels of poverty in the United States. Of course, the elite in the West never considers the possibility that they may be on the receiving end of rage as well. And of course, the election of Trump shocked the elite, because everyone was supposed to be resigned to a globalist future, a neoliberal future in which the rich get ever richer and the middle class is destroyed. But see, that's history. That's science, and there's nothing that can be done about it. I would have to say, if I had one problem with Amy Chewett's book, this argument that is made that globalization has greatly increased the average, say, earnings of people in the world's poorest countries, I can't blame her for this. Because it has been demonstrated in the last few years that this assertion was based on faulty data, that the earnings were not so low as had been previously stated. That is to say, supposedly, there's an enormous jump, and there was really not much of a jump. But on the other hand, when you are working in a factory that has suicide nets placed outside it because too many people making consumer goods for us here in the West were leaping to their deaths because conditions were so abhorrent, I guess that, that small increase in the daily wage is really not all that important. There's quite an interesting discussion of the oligarchy in Russia. The collapse of communism, of course, led to a situation where the Harvard boys were brought in, and we need the free market. We need to unleash the free market, with the result that Russians were horrified, and those people in the West who were paying any attention were horrified when they saw the streets, Moscow and Leningrad, thronged with old people, pensioners, begging for food in order to survive. And the riches of Russia, the ex-Soviet Union, ended up in the hands of 7 men, 6 of whom were Jewish. There's an amusing bit here from the book. In the spring of 2000, a professor I'll call Jerry White was furiously trying to finish up an article on the debacle of Russian privatization. Jerry and his co-authors had served as legal advisors to the Russian government during the country's mass privatization process in the late 1990s. The article described, from an insider's hindsight perspective, how Russia's pro-market reforms, which he and other Western advisors had helped devise, had gone horribly awry. Instead of dispersing ownership and creating functioning markets, these reforms had allowed a small group of greedy industrialists and bankers to plunder Russia, turning themselves almost overnight into the billionaire owners of Russia's crown jewels, while the country spiraled into chaos and lawlessness. Although not yet published, the article had already created a stir. It was to be a major mea culpa, a candid expose of the naivete of Western advisors in hopelessly over their heads. I stopped by Jerry's office one day after reading a near final version of the article. Something about the ruthless, looting, self-dealing kleptocrats turned oligarchs described in his article had struck me, and I wanted to run it by him. It seemed to me, I said to Jerry, that most of the key players in the privatization and eventual economic takeover of Russia were Jewish. Was it possible? Oh, no, Jerry replied instantly with a frown. I don't think so. Are you sure? I pressed him. If you look at their names, you can't tell anything from names. Jerry snapped impatiently, clearly not wanting to discuss the topic any further. Not all Jews, of course, react like Jerry. When I first mentioned to my husband, who is Jewish, that 6 out of 7 of Russia's wealthiest tycoons are Jewish, he raised an eyebrow. Just 6? He asked calmly. So who's the 7th guy? That's pretty funny. Yes. I don't know. I mean, the question of why the oligarchs are Jewish, Well, I suppose one of the reasons is Jewish involvement in the black market in the waning Soviet Union days, which gave them experience of real markets, which few in the country did. There's also the affinity networks, of course, but corruption, just corruption. I suppose there were people in Russia, naive people, who thought, oh, we're going to get democracy now and we're going to vote for people who are going to represent our interests. That's not what happened at all. Instead, a drunken buffoon named Boris Yeltsin was installed and later kept in power by oligarch money and by a furious effort by the United States government and media, which they both admitted to, amazingly. It is a surprise to me why Putin doesn't hate the United States, given what he knows of what they did to his country, but he still desires peace. No, they paid Yeltsin off, and they paid his family off. And this is a big problem with democracy, and it's a problem that we see in my own country of Canada, that we see in the United States of America. How is it that disastrous economic decisions keep being made? Oh, how about, these no-bid contracts, or contracts that go spectacularly bad, cost 5 times as much? Well, the reason is that rich businessmen bribe politicians to give them contracts. They bribe politicians so they're not criminally prosecuted for outrageous breaches of the law and such. It occurred to me reading this book, I was reminded of a true story about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is also discussed in the book. This book is very wide-ranging. That there was a fellow called Karl Lueger, who was a demagogue in Vienna. And around the turn of the century before that, he was elected mayor of Vienna. And the emperor, Franz Joseph, said, I can't approve this. Lueger was a famous anti-Jewish rabble-rouser. And so, come the next election, Lueger was reelected again. And Franz Joseph once again said, no, I love, the peoples of the empire are my children, and I love them equally. So he turned it down again. Comes a third election, and Lueger was elected a third time. And Franz Joseph said something like, well, the people have spoken. And of course, if the Austro-Hungarian Empire had survived, Adolf Hitler would have become, at worst, a minor member of the bureaucracy, perhaps a ticket collector or some such. Amy Chua notes in the book that, yes, under democracy, people like Hitler come to office. This is especially important in a multicultural situation. It is my very strong belief that multiculturalism can survive only and not devolve into the war of all against all with a dictator or a monarch to keep everyone in line. Otherwise, it simply doesn't work. This is a really tremendous book, and I'm sure that many people who haven't read it, after reading it, will find that their understanding of the world has changed enormously and for the better. And well, yes, you read about South Africa, and of course this book is very prescient given what is going on in South Africa now. You have two market dominant minorities there, whites and Indians, dot, not feather. And of course, there's been the possibility that we've seen in the last 2 weeks that the whites and Indians of South Africa might be slaughtered or chased out, assuming that there's anyone who would take them in. Canada, for instance, has already indicated no, that it's not going to take any South Africans in, because all this talk about farmers being murdered, it's a racist conspiracy theory. I can't recommend this book highly enough. It is It is very impressive, given how much material Amy Chua covers in this book, how much detail she goes into without losing the big picture, the elegance of her writing, and the command understanding of all of the aspects of this problem. My highest recommendation. Let's have a final look at the chat. Oh, we're still talking about Kyle? Hang on, let's see if we have any talk about The Lives of Others is a good film about the Stasi spying on its own citizens, says Media Hits. Yes, I talked about it on Theater Thursday some time ago. Master and Commander for Theater Thursday, a very unappreciated film, says Anne Run. Thank you for that. Jason Bryan, KMG, Deep Hobbes, a reference. Hitler lost his election with Hindenburg. The communists and socialists were infighting and stepped back from elections in 1933, which the Nazis were losing ground on. Well, my point stands. Without the democratic process, Hitler would have never come anywhere near to power. Oh, by the way, Karl Lueger became mayor of Vienna, and it turned out he really didn't hate Jews. It was just a pose. He knew that rabble rousing against the Jews would win him a lot of support. But after he became mayor, he demonstrated no animus against the Jews, which I suppose is one of the reasons why, when Hitler came to power in Germany, a great many people said, "Oh, we've seen this all before. Remember Karl Lueger? Yeah, well, Hitler's going to be the same." Edward Richardson says, when we turn to Putin for setting an example on fixing corruption in Russia, we've lost our minds. The Russians were not up for doing good business in government and never will be. It's their culture. The neocons and others were chortling openly 10 or 15 years ago that the Russian people were disappearing, that they would vanish from the earth. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. The Russians are doing much, much better under Putin than they were under the Harvard boys and their puppet leader. And the Russian people understand that they're doing much, much better. And the Russian people are very happy that Putin either fixed the wagons of the oligarchs or brought them to heel. Okay. I think that's it. Have you read Hillbilly Elegy, Kevin, says Oscar Toe? No, but I suppose I'm going to have to, given that he is could become a major politician in the United States. Media Hit says on Jay Leno in 2012, MLK Day, Obama was talking about homosexuality being illegal in Russia. No, it was homosexual propaganda that was illegal in Russia, which is not quite the same thing. In any event, why would Barack Obama care and appear to care so much about this? I mean, if you're not planning to live there and you don't really have any influence over the place, when Winston Churchill it was put to Winston Churchill that Tito was going to take over Yugoslavia in 1945, and the British were largely responsible for this because they had sidelined Mihailovich, and it was put to Churchill, officially, that this was going to be bad news. Churchill said, "Well, what, are you planning to live there?" Yes, that manly Churchillian wit. But this is a different situation, because the British, more than anyone else, were responsible for Tito's partisans winning victory. So, they did have a responsibility there. Obama had no responsibility for whatever happened in Russia. None whatsoever. Someone mentioned Good Will Hunting. Oh my God, I hate that movie so much. But it does did lead to one of my favorite jokes, which was on that show. It was a short-lived Fox show where Jay Moore played a Hollywood hustler, and he was browbeating. He's just terrorizing a screenwriter, and the screenwriter was telling him, trying to explain this was an art or something, and you can't rush it. And Jay Moore said, if screenwriting is so difficult, then why do Matt Damon and Ben Affleck have Oscars? Good question. Good question. Robin Williams, the worst. Just the worst. When you didn't watch Mork and Mindy, why would I watch that? But then Robin Williams, he left the show, and suddenly I started reading all these articles, hearing all these people saying that Robin Williams was the greatest comedian since what? Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, and I saw his act and I thought, this isn't funny. It's just, okay, he's just, oh, look at all the energy, look at all the exaggeration. I thought this isn't funny at all. And I thought, I don't know, I must be wrong because everyone else says he's just, so very funny. Then I saw the infamous SCTV bit where Martin Short is making fun or mimicking Robin Williams. And his whole act was, pushing things, picking up objects, and I'm climbing up a ladder. And it was for a commercial, powdered orange juice. And Joe Flaherty played, the MC, and he's just falling over laughing. And we're thinking, yeah. And I thought, I'm right. I know I'm right now. Robin Williams, not funny. And on that bombshell, I'm going to wrap up the show for this week. I went a little late today. I hope you don't mind. What's coming up next week? On Theater Thursday, I have an art film, which is from 1950 by Max Ophuls, and it is called La Ronde, a rather notorious film in its day. The source of it is a play of the same name by Arthur Schnitzler, who, of course, wrote the work that became Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut. And on the book club next week, I have, here we go. I have a novel, a truncated novel, which was rediscovered only a few years ago. It was in a drawer for 50 years or more. It's by Irene Nemirovsky, and it's called Suite Française, and it is about the collapse of the French regime in 1940 and the terror that resulted. Wholesale abandonment of Paris. And when everyone decides to get out of town, in a town as big as Paris, very bad things happen. And something happier, on Monday, June the 19th, it's a Sparks show tonight. I'm going to talk about Sparks, how much I love them, why I love them, and how 2021 is their apotheosis. I'll be back on the air Monday at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. I thank you all for tuning in. I appreciate it. If you like the show or any part of it, I would appreciate it if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to make a donation to this live stream, which is always appreciated, but especially appreciated now at this time in my life, my PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. If you're in Canada, donations to this live stream can be made directly via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.